Without warning, they emerged from the mist-shrouded waters off England's eastern shore. The year was 793. Their target, Lindisfarne, a sacred island monastery where Christian monks lived in peaceful devotion. What happened next would send shockwaves across an entire continent. The Vikings had arrived, and they came with fire and steel. Monks were cut down where they stood. Sacred treasures vanished into the holds of sleek warships. By dawn, the raiders had disappeared back across the dark waters, leaving only blood and ashes in their wake. This wasn't just a raid. It was Europe's violent introduction to a force that would reshape its destiny for 300 years. These seafaring warriors from the frozen north became the nightmare of medieval Europe, launching campaigns of plunder that reached from the British Isles deep into Russia, across the Mediterranean, and even to the gates of Constantinople itself, that magnificent city they called Miklagard. Their longships cut through waters where others dared not sail. Their mastery of the sea gave them something no army could counter: the power to strike anywhere, at any time, without warning. But here's what doesn't add up. The Vikings faced enemies who were themselves born warriors. The Anglo-Saxons, the Franks, these weren't soft targets. They came from cultures built on martial pride and battlefield glory. So what gave these Scandinavian raiders such a devastating advantage? Was it just better ships and navigation? Or was there something deeper, something psychological that made them so terrifyingly effective? Professor Tom Shippey has spent decades studying Viking culture and medieval texts. His conclusion is striking. The Vikings possessed a unique mindset, a way of thinking about death and danger that separated them from everyone else. And the best evidence for this mindset? The Vikings left it behind in their own words, preserved in the sagas written in Old Norse, their native tongue. Now, there's a problem with these sagas. They include the famous sagas of the Icelanders, the royal chronicles known as Konungasagur, and the ancient tales called Fornaldarsagur. Modern scholars look at these texts with suspicion, and for good reason. Most were written centuries after the events they describe, penned by Icelandic scribes far removed from the original action. Critics dismiss them as fiction, as fairy tales with no historical value. But that's not the complete picture. Yes, portions are clearly mythological. You can spot the fantasy elements without much difficulty. Yet much of what's recorded in these sagas rings with authenticity. Consider this. In cultures without widespread literacy, memory becomes sacred. Stories pass from generation to generation with remarkable accuracy. Family histories get preserved with care because they matter, because they define identity and legacy. These sagas, fictional or not, reveal something consistent and unmistakable, a worldview that appears again and again. It's what we might call the Viking mindset, and it has two defining characteristics. First, an intense fascination with death, particularly with how a warrior meets his end. The sagas overflow with famous last words, legendary final stands, and death songs. Second, a sense of humor that's unlike anything else in medieval literature. It's dark, often cruel, laced with irony even in the face of annihilation. It's humor that laughs at death itself. Let's examine 5 death scenes from these ancient texts to understand what they reveal. The legend of Ragnar Lodbrok has echoed through centuries. His saga claims he was born a Swedish prince who slayed a monstrous dragon in his youth. Fame followed him like a shadow, but fame demands feeding, and so Ragnar set sail for England, hungry for greater glory and richer plunder. Fortune abandoned him off the coast of Northumbria. His ship broke apart in a storm, and he was dragged ashore as a prisoner. King Ella, a Christian ruler with no love for pagan raiders, decided to make an example of this infamous Viking. He chose a death designed to inspire terror. Ragnar would be thrown into a pit writhing with venomous serpents. As the snakes struck and venom coursed through his veins, Ragnar called out words that would become legendary. In Old Norse, he proclaimed, "Knija mundu grisir ef galter hag visi." Translated, it means, "The piglets would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers." But there's more to it than that. The word knija doesn't just mean grunt. It sounds like grunting, almost like the squeal of pigs. You could render it. The piglets would squeal their little hearts out, if they knew what's happening to the old boar. It's a joke. A dying man, consumed by snake venom, makes a barnyard joke. But look beneath the surface. This isn't just humor, it's a threat wrapped in mockery, aimed directly at King Ella. The Piglets are Ragnar's sons. The message is clear. When my boys find out what you've done, what they'll do to you will be unspeakable. Here's where it gets interesting. A Latin chronicler recorded this incident, proving the story existed early, but he completely misunderstood it. He thought Ragnar was hoping his sons would arrive in time to rescue him. He missed the point entirely. Ragnar wasn't pleading for salvation. He knew he was finished. He was promising vengeance from beyond the grave. Now, did Ragnar actually die in a snake pit? Almost certainly not. The story was likely invented, but his sons? They were very real. In 865, the Ragnarsons landed in England at the head of what chronicles called the Great Army. They carved a path of destruction through East Anglia and Northumbria. And yes, they killed King Ella. The historical record confirms it. So here's the theory. The entire tale of Ragnar's death might have been created retroactively to justify the invasion. Why did the Ragnarsons attack England? To avenge their father. You need a story about how the father died, something dramatic enough to motivate such a massive campaign. Whether true or fabricated, the story reveals how Vikings thought about death and revenge, how even in defeat, they found ways to strike back. According to ancient legend, Hrolf ruled Denmark in the 6th century, a Golden Age king commanding a great hall near what's now the village of Lejre. He kept a company of legendary warriors, champions whose names were sung in verses. But power attracts enemies. Hrolf's own cousin, Hjorvard, harbored ambitions. He struck at dawn, catching the king unprepared. The battle that followed was brutal and short. When the sun rose fully, Hrolf lay dead, his champions fallen around him, all except one. Vöggr, the weakest man in Hrolf's service, somehow survived. He'd always been the target of jokes, the butt of every crude jibe in the hall. When he'd sworn to avenge Hrolf's death, the warriors had left. Now, covered in blood and surrounded by corpses, he was dragged before the new king. Hjorvard made a catastrophic error in judgment. For some incomprehensible reason, he thought it would be wise to extract a pledge of loyalty from Hrolf's last surviving champion. They hauled Vöggr to his feet and demanded he swear allegiance. To formalize the oath, Hjorvard handed Vöggr his own sword. You can imagine what happened next. Vöggr seized the blade and drove it through Hjorvard's body in one fluid motion. The new king died on the spot, and with him, his entire dynasty collapsed. Vöggr was killed immediately afterward, of course, but he'd fulfilled his vow. He'd turned the tables with a wit as sharp as the blade he'd wielded. So we see the pattern again. Ragnar's joke was at King Ella's expense. Vöggr's joke was at King Hjorvard's expense. It's a dark kind of humor, finding comedy in the moment of violent revenge. For a long time, historians treated King Hrolf the same way they treated King Arthur, as a mythological figure with no basis in reality. Then archaeologists began excavating at Lejre. What they discovered changed everything. They unearthed the foundations of enormous halls, one after another, 6 in total, spanning the Viking era and earlier. The traditional site of Hrolf's court turned out to be real, a genuine power center in early medieval Denmark. The legends contain truth, after all. The Jomsvikings occupy a unique place in Viking lore. They were mercenaries, elite warriors bound by an unbreakable code of honor. Their fortress, Jomsborg, stood somewhere on the Baltic coast. In 986, they accepted a contract from the Danish king to subjugate Jarl Hakon of Lade and his territories. But at the Battle of Hjörungavágr, everything went wrong. Jarl Hakon and his son Eirik crushed them utterly. Vikings rarely gave quarter, and they expected none in return. After the battle, the surviving Jomsvikings were lined up for execution. One by one, they would be beheaded. But these weren't ordinary warriors. Their code forbade any display of fear. One man refused to kneel, insisting he be beheaded while standing facing the axe, so everyone could witness that he didn't flinch when the blade fell. Another Jomsviking did kneel, but made an unusual request. He worried about his hair getting soaked with blood. Could someone kindly hold his hair forward over his head while the execution proceeded? A man stepped forward to oblige. As the executioner raised his axe and brought it down, the Jomsviking jerked his head back at the last instant. The falling blade missed his neck entirely and instead severed both hands of the man holding his hair. The response was unexpected. Everyone burst into laughter. Jarl Eirik found it so hilarious, so perfectly executed, that he declared that Jomsviking would be spared. The warrior, demonstrating the honor of his code, refused clemency unless all his surviving brothers were released as well. Eirik agreed, and the remaining Jomsvikings walked free. It sounds absurd, completely fabricated. No historian would accept such a tale at face value. Except about 15 miles from Vöggr, road workers recently uncovered something remarkable. A mass grave containing approximately 50 skeletons and a separate pile of skulls. Every single skeleton had been decapitated. Analysis confirmed they were all male, mostly young, and all of Scandinavian origin. Even more striking, several had been beheaded from the front, exactly as described in the saga. Fiction had archaeological corroboration. Olaf Haraldsson became king of Norway and would eventually be canonized as the nation's patron saint. But before his conversion to Christianity, he'd been a fearsome Viking warrior. In 1029, Danish forces allied with local jarls drove him into exile. When Olaf returned the following year to reclaim his throne, he faced an enormous army of hostile farmers who rejected his rule. Retreat wasn't an option he would consider. On the morning of battle, restless and unable to sleep, Olaf summoned his poet Thormod and asked for a song to pass the hours until the army assembled. Thormod's choice was peculiar. He began reciting the Bjarkamal, an ancient poem about the final stand of King Hrolf, the same king we discussed earlier. The poem describes warriors rising to face certain death. Listen to how it sounds in Old Norse. Dagger is uppkommen, dinja hana fyrar, mal is vilmogum at vinner urfi. In translation, day has arrived, the roosters beat their wings. It's time for wretched serfs to begin their heavy labor. Wake now, wake, company of friends, all you finest ones. Har the hard grip, Hrolf the shooter, men of noble birth who never flee. I don't wake you to wine or whispered words of women. I wake you to Hilda's harsh game. Think about that choice for a moment. It's essentially a suicide poem, a song about warriors who know they're marching toward death. Is this really the best way to raise morale before a battle? For Vikings, apparently yes. The men loved it. They thought it was perfect. Exactly the right sentiment. Let's get started, they said. But the odds were catastrophic. King Olaf fought in the front rank, as a true warrior king should, and he fell beneath a storm of spear thrusts and axe blows. His chosen companions, his personal guard, died beside him, just as the poem had foretold. Thormod, the poet, survived, through no fault of his own. When the battle ended and defeat was complete, he lamented that he hadn't been granted the honor of dying with his king. At that precise moment, an arrow came from nowhere and struck him. The implication in the saga is unmistakable. The dead king sent it. Olaf heard his poet's lament and gave him what he desired, the chance to join him in death. Thormod composed a poem about his own wound as he died, standing on his feet, still reciting verse. He never finished the final line. A teenage bystander completed it for him. That boy's name was Harald Hardrada. Harald Hardrada grew into one of history's most formidable Vikings. His adventures took him east to Kiev, where he served at the court of Grand Prince Yaroslav. From there he traveled to Constantinople, commanding the legendary Varangian Guard that protected the Byzantine Emperor himself. As King of Norway, Harald earned his epithet, the Hard Ruler. He was brave, ruthless, and hungry for conquest. In 1066, he set his sights on England, but King Harold Godwinson responded with remarkable speed, marching north so rapidly that he caught the Norwegian invasion force completely unprepared at Stamford Bridge. It was a scorching hot day, and the Norwegians had left their heavy armor and shields down at their ships. They found themselves facing an armored English army while virtually unprotected. Harald Hardrada, true to form, didn't hesitate. He advanced at the head of his men despite the disadvantage. According to the Heimskringla sagas written by Snorri Sturluson, he composed poetry even in that moment. In Old Norse, Fram gongum ver I fylkingu brinjalazir un blaragjar. Translation: Forward we march in formation, without mail against blue steel edges. Helmets gleam. Mine I lack. Our gear lies down by the ships. Harald, who fancied himself a poet of refined taste, considered this verse for a moment and apparently found it too simple, too crude. He composed another version in a more complex, sophisticated meter and declared it superior. Then he threw himself into combat, fighting with his sword gripped in both hands, unarmored, fearless, defiant to his final breath. An English arrow found his throat, and he fell alongside most of his army. History often calls him the last Viking. The Norwegians had arrived in 400 ships. The survivors sailed home in 24. The Anglo-Saxons let them go. That defeat effectively ended any notion that England could be conquered by Scandinavian forces. The Viking Age had reached its conclusion. Harald Hardrada died as he lived, making jokes, composing poetry, swinging his weapon with both hands until death claimed him. Now, could those poems really have come from Harald himself? It seems unlikely. Who was present to record them? Nearly all the Norwegians perished. Snorri Sturluson probably invented them a century later to enhance his narrative. But if so, he captured something authentic. The verses express a rueful acceptance, a sense of, well, they caught us this time. We're not going to win this one. Oh well, nothing to do but fight it out. That attitude feels genuinely Viking. The Battle of Stamford Bridge carried consequences far beyond Norwegian ambitions. Yes, it was catastrophic for the invasion force, but it was also catastrophic for England. The English took severe casualties. 3 weeks later, they faced another battle at Hastings against William the Conqueror. Had they been at full strength, the outcome might have been very different. On October 14, 1066, the English army was crushed. King Harold Godwinson died on the field. England's new king, William, was himself descended from Viking settlers in Normandy. The Viking Age concluded, but Viking blood still shaped European destiny. For nearly 3 centuries, Europe had endured the onslaught of these Scandinavian warriors. What ultimately made them so dangerous? It wasn't just their ships or their weapons or their tactics. It was their relationship with death itself. Other warriors feared dying. Vikings seemed to view it as inevitable, even amusing. They faced annihilation with defiance, yes, but also with a matter-of-fact acceptance that's genuinely unsettling. And always, there was room for a joke. Ragnar could use vulgar barnyard language while dying in agony. Vöggr could exploit a moment of trust to exact revenge. The Jomsviking could play a practical joke with his own execution. Thormod and Harald could nitpick about poetry while marching toward death. The message in all these stories is the same. Death is certain. It's coming for everyone. But before it arrives, let's make this moment memorable. Let's leave something behind that people will talk about. That's what made Vikings so terrifying to their enemies. You could kill them. History proves that conclusively, but frighten them? That was impossible. They always came back at you, always found a way to strike one last blow, always turned defeat into something darkly legendary. You weren't safe from a Viking until the very last one lay dead. And even then, you had to wonder if somehow, from beyond the grave, they were still laughing at you.